Oh, my bad. Welcome to week 8 of web design decal. Excuse my look today. I'm really tired. Um, but yeah. Um, yeah, today we're going to be going through intro to JavaScript, and this is where we actually start getting to the really fun stuff and the things we can actually code with. So yeah, some announcements we have a decent amount of announcements. For a lot of you who came out last week to the project presentations, you guys filled out the midterm feedback. So we really appreciate all the feedback you gave us, whether it's good or bad. We reviewed them and we are currently re-reviewing them. And so we're going to be rolling out a lot of changes based on your feedback. So thank you for that. And again, the feedback form is always open throughout the semesters, not just midterm and final project feedback. So you can fill that out whenever. The first thing from feedback, we noticed that a lot of people didn't know how to didn't know how to create files from scratch because we give you most of the skeleton code to work with, which is very true. And also, code organization was hard for some people. So to tackle that, I know this is kind of late, but this Thursday in lab, we're going to be holding kind of like a workshop. Every TA is going to go through a how to create files from scratch and a code organization workshop for everyone. So please come out to the lab if you want to learn about that. Our weekly homeworks resume. So hopefully you had a good week catching up on other work or just relaxing last week because we had no work due, or we just had no work due this week. But so today's homework or this week's homework is actually going to be due next Wednesday, not Tuesday, because next Tuesday is election day. And we want you to have time to vote if you're going to vote in person. Also stay safe. So keep in mind, just for this week, this homework 7 is due on Wednesday instead of Tuesday. Other homeworks after that will be due on Tuesdays like regular. And also based on your feedback, we noticed a lot of people really struggled during last week when the midterm project was due, just because there were so many assignments due at the same time. And we want to apologize for that. We definitely had a lot due. So to tackle that, we released the final project earlier, like a week earlier than usual. We can't really extend the deadline, like the deadline later on, because it is due the last week of our class. And so we can't really go past that, and we have to submit grades by a deadline. So the only way to tackle this is to release the final project earlier. So you have over a month to do this. And this whole project is based on your own creativity. You get to decide what you want to make. And we also reduce the number of requirements in the project down. So it should be very doable in a month. So a couple due dates is check-in. It's the same format as the midterm project. You have a check-in, you do the Figma mockups, get it checked in by November 12th. And then the actual project is due after Thanksgiving break on December 1st at like midnight. So again, you have well over a month to work on this. And we'll be teaching you a lot of JavaScript stuff, which is good because by the time you finish your mockups and check-ins are over, you guys will have all the knowledge you need to code up your websites. And for this project, you won't be submitting on Portal. You'll be just submitting a link. You'll actually be hosting a real website with a real URL this time with your project. So actually other people can actually view your stuff online. So you'll be submitting that on the project submission form. Again, don't submit on Portal. But yeah, that's basically it. Please come out to Thursday Lab. And Nick, take it away.
All right, awesome. So we're gonna get started with JavaScript now. This is the third section of the class. We've just finished covering HTML and CSS. So now we're moving on to JavaScript, which, as we mentioned during week 1, is the function of a website. So 4 main things we're going to be talking about. What is JavaScript? What can we do with it? What does it look like? And doing a little bit of hands-on mixed throughout the slides. So to start, what is JavaScript? Well, it's a programming language that is completely different from HTML and CSS. And if you have heard of Java, it is also different from Java, though the syntax is somewhat similar. It might look a little scary at first, but trust me, it's not. And just like how we wrote HTML and CSS to tell the browser what we wanted things to look like, we're going to use JavaScript to tell the browser what we want the browser to basically do. But what does that exactly mean? What can we do with it? So our goal with writing JavaScript code is to add interactivity to our pages. So rather than just writing out the HTML and CSS statically, you can actually change it on the fly so that, for example, you can click on an image and a pop-up will appear, or you can have an image carousel where it's like animated and you have like a number of images sliding at a timed interval. Basically, anything, or not anything, but a lot of the features that you see on the internet and a lot of stuff that we've been asked, you'll learn how to do in this section. JavaScript also works on the back end, but this class does not go into that. So again, thinking about how it works, basically if a user clicks on a certain element, for example, a button, a link, or an image, then JavaScript would change some sort of HTML, CSS code or add or remove based on whatever you want to do. So this is the sort of pattern that you want to keep in mind before you actually start writing out your code. So a few examples. So one probably less than intuitive example, but it's pretty straightforward, is that when you click on an image, it could increase in size. Now, you may not necessarily want this to happen, but this is something that JavaScript can certainly do for you. Now, what does that mean? Well, we want to increase its size so we can change the CSS width property using JavaScript. As another example, a user can click on a button and it can change the colors to dark mode, which I'm sure you've seen across the web. So this basically changes the CSS so that we go from a sort of light color scheme to a more darker color scheme with, like, for example, a black background and white text versus a lighter colored background and a darker colored text. So putting that into our line of thinking, we want to change the color to dark mode, which means we change the color, the CSS property of both color and background color to make that work. We have a couple more examples here, but I'm going to let you guys take a look at this yourself since the possibilities are endless after all. So JavaScript's role in a web page. When we write HTML, it shows up on the .html file, and when we do the CSS, or when we write the CSS, it shows up as if there were CSS selectors referring to like specific elements on the page. What about JavaScript? Where does it belong and what does it do? So it's not just going to show up on the page unless we tell it to modify something, which we'll actually learn next week. So for now, we're going to be covering some basic topics using the Chrome DevTools, which is just the inspector. And there's a tab there that says console, which we'll show you in a little bit. So first off, we won't need this now, but for just to keep this in mind, just as we did with the CSS file, we'll need to link any JavaScript files that we write onto our HTML file. So similar, in a similar way as we use the link tag for CSS, we will use the script tag for JavaScript using the same sort of convention that we used before for file paths. So if I were in a home directory with the index.html and our JavaScript file was named script.js, within the assets folder, within the JS folder, we would just use this sort of this format. We'd also use script tags instead of the link, and then use a source attribute and then put in the link right there. So today's concepts, we're going to be going over what variables are, how to use the console.log to print stuff out into the console, and the alert, as well as strings and functions. Our overall goal today is to be able to read basic JavaScript syntax and do a little bit of math. So first off, what are variables? Well, variables are similar to what we see in math, where we assign a certain string or number, whatever that may be, to a variable, which is represented by, in this case, name and age. Within JavaScript, in order to declare a variable, you'll need to use the let keyword, which means that which tells the JavaScript compiler that we're creating a variable and assigning this value to that variable. Typically, you would want to make the variable names meaningful. So in this case, as you can see, we're using name for Joe and age for 20, or actually and then use the value to store that. And remember that if we are using if we want to use a string, which is basically just any text, you'll want to put quotation marks around the text. And if we're just doing a number, then we'll be fine just putting a number by itself. if we wanted to combine both text and a number, for example, Joe 1, we would have to use a string because the Joe portion would not be a number. So another thing we can do with strings is to concatenate them. That basically just means putting text together. So for example, here we can assign Nicholas to the name Nicholas to the name variable, and then this weird thing right here to the greeting variable. Now, what does this mean? So anytime we have a plus, we are basically adding together the variables literally. So in this case, we would end up getting howdy with a space, Nicholas, and then the exclamation mark. So this would be our result right here. Oh, and then also we do console.log, which basically just prints out whatever value is assigned to greeting within the console. We'll show you how you can do that in a little bit. And then another thing you can do is alert, which is it basically creates this little pop-up on your window. So in this case, we assign the string Miles to the variable name, and then concatenate howdy, the name variable, as well as the exclamation mark, and assign that to greeting. One thing to keep in mind, I forgot to mention, is that when we do reference a variable, you don't want to put quotes around it. So in this case, if we had quotes around name, then our greeting would just be howdy name exclamation rather than howdy Miles exclamation mark. And as you can see here, this is what it looks like when you do an alert. Now, here's a little exercise for you guys. Go ahead and type in the chat what you think this would print out in the alert, and we'll see if you guys get it. I'll give you like a minute or so. Great. Yeah, it looks like most everyone has it correct. So I'm just going to show you what it would look like if we're using the console. So as you can see, it would end up looking like this result area right here. So I'm just going to copy this directly. And when we actually open a new Chrome window, we can just right-click, hit Inspect, and then click here next to Elements. There's a console button, and we'll bring up this. I'm just going to make the font a little bigger, and then I'll paste it in. And press enter. So now all these variables are assigned to their values within this console. And now what I can do is just call the alert, and it pops up a little alert window that gives me that message. I don't know if you guys can see this, but it basically just looks like what we have in this result image right here. Okay, apparently you can't see that, but it basically looks like this result right here when we paste it in. Do we have any questions before we move on to math? Feel free to just type it in the chat or unmute. No? All right, let's move on then. Okay, so when it comes to math in JavaScript, it's basically like, hold on, is there a question? Yeah, so when we declare variables in JavaScript, there's actually a couple ways you can do it. You can use either let, a var, or a const. For this class, we won't get too in depth into the differences between the three, but when you are declaring a new variable that you've never seen before, you do need to use let. And we'll talk a little bit about block scoping, which would basically allows you or tells you when you can assign a new value to a variable without the let. But when you are creating a new variable, you do want to use the let. Okay, I think that's the only question. Great question. So moving on to math, Just like you have done in elementary school, you just basically do math exactly how you would expect. So if we're assigning the variable age to 25, we instead of writing 25, we could use 20 plus 5, which, as we all know, adds up to 25. Here, okay, yeah, this is exactly the question that uh, that Julio asked just now. So here, after we initialize the value for age to be 25, we can actually reassign the value right here. So instead of writing let again, all we would need to do is set age to 20 minus 2.5. And really this right-hand side here could be any value. We could do 3, we could do 0, we could do 1. And it would now make it so that anytime you have an age, or anytime you reference age again, it would now be 20 minus 2.5 rather than 20 plus 5. Now, if we want to use age, as I mentioned, down here, we're assigning double the age to the double age variable. This is new, so remember we're using let. And all we would have to do is reference age and then multiply by 2 with the times 2. One operation that you may not be familiar with is this little percent sign. That's formally called a modulo operator, which basically is a remainder operator. So if we have, for example, 21 mod 7, then we would have or 21 mod 4, then we would have a remainder of 1 because 5 times 4 is 20, and then we would have a remainder of 1 to make it 21. Any questions? Does age type change? Right here, it does not, because JavaScript doesn't really care about the difference between decimals and whole numbers. Any other questions? All right. Yeah, so now we're going to dive a little bit into functions, which may seem a little familiar if you have a CS background, but if you don't, this can get a little confusing, so don't worry if you don't get it the first time. So this is a bit analogous to math, where it basically, a function takes in a value as input, does something inside, and then outputs a value. Now this is useful if we have a piece of code that we want to like continually reuse. For example, if we had like a 5-line chunk of code that we used in multiple locations within our script, then we could write a function and then we could just call it every time we wanted to do something. So a bit on the notation. When we write out a function and then the name of the function, this is declaring that we're creating a function. So in this case, we want to write a function that squares a number. So we'll name it square, call it a function, and then we take in a parameter, which is enclosed within this parentheses. In this case, we want to take in a variable called x, and then we want to use these brackets so that we know that we're inside the function, and then anything inside is processed here. So we take in an x, and then we would multiply x by x and then return it. Return is basically meaning that it's the final output value, which means that when you pass any number into this x area, or into square as the parameter x, you would get back x squared. Yeah, so when we want to call the function itself, we can basically just initialize. If we want to save the actual result, we can initialize a variable, for example, y here, and then pass in 5 to the square function. Now, what exactly is happening here? We know that the square of 5 is 25, so let's just make sure that's actually the case. So we see the 5 put in here, and then we let the result be equal to 5 times 5, which is 25. So now result has been assigned the value 25. We now return the result, which we know is 25, which then basically, if you want to think about it this way, it's basically replaces this square 5 call and just sets y to 25. Now we come down here to the second line. And what we do is square y, which we know is 25. So z would now be 25 squared. A little bit about the curly braces here. What these are called are, well, curly braces. So any variable that is defined or initialized inside these curly braces are not accessible outside, and this is a property of the let, any variable that is initialized with let. So if I were to come out here and make like a third line, for example, down here below the let z line and say, try to reference result, that would end up resulting in an error, no pun intended. Because basically it's outside the curly braces, so we can't actually access it. Now, if we declared the result outside, for example, above the function, and then just modified result in here without the let, then in that case, we would be able to modify or access the value of result. I'm gonna actually show that here on the console, just so you get a better sense of what I'm talking about. Let me just reload. Okay. So here, if I wanted to see what the value of y is, not just to verify that I understand math, we'll see that. Oh wait, can you see this actually? Over there. Okay, so I basically just pasted in all the code that we have there, and then I called 25. It told me it's, or 5, and we know it's 25. We can do the same thing with z, and we now know that's 25 squared, which is 625. Now, if we were to do this sort of thing here, I'm going to reload the console, and then let's see, let's declare result. Oh, sorry. Let's just declare the result here, and then do this. Now this works because we know our result is declared up here, and then we're initializing it with a value inside of the function. So y and z both work, and then in this case, if we wanted to grab result, well, we know it's 625 because our most recent call to square passed in x as 25 and then modified result so that it's now 25 times 25. If we were to come back to this case, and then we try to call result out here, you'll see that it doesn't actually work because result only exists within the confines of these two brackets. As you can see, we get an error. So you can think about it as like the result being inside, I don't know, a room. So because it's outside of the room, and you're outside, you don't actually know what it is, if that makes sense. That's a pretty terrible analogy, in my opinion. But yeah, any questions? I know that could get a little confusing. When should we use the let inside the curly brackets? So you want to use let within the curly brackets if it's the only time you're declaring the variable. So for example, in this case, we're using let because result hasn't been declared before. In the other case where I had let out here outside of the function, we could, or actually we don't need to use let because it's already been initialized outside, which means we're just modifying the function on the outside. Does that make sense? Perfect. Awesome. So another caveat to functions is that they don't always need a return value. So for example, if we define this function as show greeting, taking in a name, well, what happens? We go in here, do our same greeting modification. We initialize greeting using this name variable as well as some strings, concatenate that together, and then call alert. Well, basically all that does is, well, you'll get a little alert pop-up that says howdy name, which in this case, we're calling it is Miles with the exclamation point at the end. Oh, one other thing I should be more explicit about is that a function by itself is not going to do anything. In order to actually get the result or perform the action that's in the function, we'll need to call the function. And you do that using this sort of notation. So you write out the function name and then pass in whatever value you want to pass in for the input. We can also put comments within the functions or within JavaScript, just like we did in HTML and CSS. The syntax is a little bit different than HTML. I think it should be the same as CSS here. So you just do two slashes and then your comment, and then this won't be considered as like part of your JavaScript, basically. You can also do a multi-line comment using the closing and opening sets of slashes and stars. Now, we have one more exercise here. So I'll give you guys a minute. Go ahead and read through it and see if you can tell me what this prints out as. Great. So it looks like, yeah, it looks like everyone's got it. I have taken WDD 100 times. Who wouldn't want to do that? And yeah, before we wrap up, any other questions?
You should show them how, like, walk them through that last problem for the people
Oh,
who
this one.
might have not gotten it. Yep.
Yeah. So let me just copy this. Um, I'll, you can see my screen, right? Just want to make sure. The
Yep.
console? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so every time you reload your page, your console does disappear. So all the variables that you defined last time are, it basically forgets about it. Um, okay, I think we're actually oh wait, never mind, sorry. So we do this, we set out our function, and then we make our call right here. Um, And then when we go through and hit enter, we'll get the answer that a lot of you, oh crap, what did I do? Oh, the space right there is an issue. Okay. Uh, Sorry, give me 1 second. Do
Just
something.
type it out. I think there's some indenting problems in the slides.
Oh, there are? Okay.
Yeah, probably.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I guess for the sake of time, I won't type it out. But the if the spacing were correct, basically this do something called passes in the string WDD and the number or num as 10. We take that in here, and then we change num from 10 to 10 plus 90, which is 100, and then initialize the result variable to be this string, appending the I have taken to course to the spaces to num and times, which gives us as you guys mentioned in the chat, I have taken WDD space 100 times, which would or should look like this. But unfortunately, it seems like there's like some sort of indenting error. Um, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and fix that in slides for you guys. But yeah, that's basically it. Any questions? when you come back out of the function. Yeah, so if you initialize the variable inside the function, then going back on the previous point, you won't be able to access it again, which means that every time you run the function, you'll be initializing a new variable, and it won't like remember what it was in the past. If you have declared, or if you initialize the variable outside of the function, so let res out here, say like where this error line is, and then you were just like modifying res every time you ran the function, you would be able to do like what is it, res, and then that would give you like the previous one. But again, it comes down to the whole issue with the brackets and where you define the res. I think I included a little supplemental article here somewhere, because I know that can get a little confusing. Okay, maybe I didn't paste it in. It should be here somewhere. But if not, I will add it in the chat and post it on Piazza. If we said val equals 10, if we said val equals 10 and pass it into our function, would the val be changed to 100 outside the function? So in this case, if you're referring to the num, it would not, because this num is a local variable that only exists within this set of brackets. So if I were to reference, or if I were to, for example, say console.log num out here, this line would result in an error because we don't actually know what num is, because it doesn't exist outside of this universe in this function. Does that make sense?
I think she means like, what if you initialize val right before we call the function and put val into the num argument?
Like let val equals 10 and then
Yeah,
val like that.
yeah. Like, would
Okay,
it
so
change then?
yeah, so this wouldn't change because we're passing val in as num, and num is basically taking on, well, we're assigning 10 to num, and then we're modifying num itself, which doesn't actually point to val. It's basically creating a copy of what we had passed in, rather than making like a pointer towards that value. Any other questions? Awesome. So I think we can take like a 5-minute break, and then we have the design section afterwards.
Okay, it's been a little while since I've given a lecture. Yeah, hopefully everybody is back from break. Hope midterm season is treating you well. Yeah, this week we're going to talk about designing with impact and kind of introducing what you'll need to do case studies or anything like that if you're interested in being a designer in the future. And yeah. There we go. So what does that actually mean to design with impact? Let's go over some key terms. First, this is kind of a review from our first lecture of the class. So user experience is a person's emotions and attitudes about using a product, system, or service. It says a person here, but the user of whatever you're making may not be a person. But we'll be focusing on people for this class because I'm pretty sure it's going to be a person interacting with your websites. But yeah, this is a topic that we've touched on throughout the class so far, but not explicitly talked about it or defined it. So human-centered design. And again, like I just said, most of our users are going to be human. So it's pretty important that we know about this. So what is human-centered design? It's basically a design approach that incorporates the human perspective, or what works best for humans. So understanding human psychology and human habits in order to design better. And we've talked a little bit about human psychology and behavioral economics in this class so far, and that kind of ties into human-centered design. It's kind of a high-level conceptual understanding of humans. But on a more practical basis, it's either understanding the psychology or just keeping in mind that it's a human that's going to be using it and understanding what humans need. So why is this important? Because we're mainly designing for humans, and also empathizing with others and understanding how we work makes us design things that are actually useful and effective. If we design for something other than a human, when a human is what's using it, like, what is the point of that? Of course, the human isn't going to understand how to use it or be able to use it effectively. Yeah, that's basically the idea. So impact isn't just user experience, it's experience and function, because yes, function is part of having a good experience, but I feel like it is important to state them as separate things, because a good experience can be, it looks pretty, or it's appealing to certain parts of a person, but maybe it's not actually functionally optimal. At least I feel like that's how people generally interpret user experience or a good experience. Yeah, we don't want people to just feel good about using it. We want it to actually be productive and innovative, hopefully. So let's go through the process. This is kind of human-centered design, kind of just the design process, and it's what people talk about all the time when they talk about going into design or how you should go about designing stuff. And you'll hear my thoughts about this process later, but we're going to go through it. So I got this from some university, I linked it, but this model is called the double diamond model of design. And last semester, I actually taught a different version of this lecture. So that has more of a focus on human-centered design specifically, but I think it's actually easier to understand with the double diamond. So let's walk through slowly what each part of this is, because I know this is kind of a lot to unpack. So on the left, sorry, I'm very tired. It's been a long week and it's only Tuesday. You start with a challenge or a problem that you want to solve. So let's try to think of an example. I don't know. Let's use Kingpin. There is a shortage of good donut websites. How about that? So what do we do about this shortage of good donut websites? Hang on, there's something in chat. Mood. Yes. It's midterm season, homies. Yeah. So what do we do with it? So let's get into the steps, which are kind of labeled at the bottom. So, oh my God, there's something in my eye. If you see me continually touching it, it's because there's something in my eye. Yeah, I'll eventually get it out. So what does discover entail? This thing called user research that you've probably heard me say or somebody else say in the industry, empathy and understanding. So user research is basically doing research on who's going to use your product. The research can be interviews, surveys, desk research, which is just like a general term for Googling stuff in depth and reading a lot of stuff. It's basically reading academic articles about human psychology, if that's something that you need to do. Or maybe it's reviews of these shitty donut sites. People will talk about why it's shitty, what they want instead. And that's super useful. Social media even is very useful for understanding how people feel about things. And it counts as legitimate because that's where people go and show how they're feeling. And you go through all of this research to empathize with your users. And I'll keep using this word empathy probably over and over again. And it's something designers also use a lot. And it's because we want to emphasize that it's empathy rather than just understanding, because you want to be able to feel for your users in order to address their pain points, which is kind of what causes them pain, or like, what do they really hate about the problem? What are the worst components of the problem? And you want to be able to fully know, maybe without totally experiencing it, but you want to know exactly what your users are going through. Sometimes part of user research is also trying to experience with your users what they're actually going through. And sometimes your interviews happen while you're shadowing them through doing a job or going through their daily life. And then you can see it observationally, what's happening. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, basically this first step, discover, is understanding who's using it, why they're using it, how they're going to use it, and like what they really need from it, and how can we alleviate these pain points and what they dislike. And what are the pain points. So yeah. Then the next part of the process of define, it entails the problem space. So this is very broadly put, but it's like, what is the actual problem that we are facing? And as you can see in this previous slide, there's a reason why there's a shape for the diamond. So it goes out because when you do all this research, you're actually expanding the scope of what you're looking for. You look through all the different details of your users and all the different possible avenues you could take with solving the problem. And then this next step goes into it more and refines the scope again. So what you do is you pull insights through synthesis from your research. There are tons of different methods for this that I'm not going to go into. You can look into that online. But you understand more of like what is possible for you to achieve, I guess, and you hone in on a certain part of the problem that you really want to focus on. And going from how can we solve this problem of having only really terrible donut sites to how might we make a donut site that people want to use regularly, or I don't know, you would narrow down the scope from just we need a donut site that actually is good to what is good about it and like what kind of good donut site is it? What does it mean for a donut site to be good? And you might have heard when I was phrasing that new version of the problem with how might we, and that's what the HMW stands for. There's also like how can we or whatever, but how might we is basically a super easy way to start thinking about your problem space. If you put it in the phrasing of one question, it makes it incredibly specific to what you should go and look into and try to solve for. So this first stage, or this first diamond, is all about understanding the context and understanding what your problem is, and kind of setting up the groundwork on how you're going to go about solving it. And you see the arrows back and forth, and that's because they feed into each other. The define part draws from the discover, and sometimes once you've defined your scope more, you need to do even more research in order to understand how to go about solving it. And the arrow going to the right is all of the research that you've already done feeds into how you're going to define the problem. And yeah, now that you've covered this diamond, you've understood the context, you've understood the user, and you understand the way that you should go about solving the problem, you can begin solving it. So yeah, you still haven't solved your problem. So what do you do now? And this is at the point where you have your design challenge. You know exactly what you're actually designing for. And this, in my opinion, is the most fun part about designing, and that's the actual problem solving and the ideation. So we're at the develop stage now. And what does developing entail? It's basically just brainstorming and coming up with ideas. And people have all these like fancy names like ideation and like affinity mapping, which is literally just writing your ideas on Post-it notes. I'm not joking. Like they have all these fancy names for this, but really this is the time when you can think of the most optimal solution, like screw with reality. Like here, if we're really innovating and really want to change the world, here's like what we would design for this problem. And limitations and stuff come later. This is where all the like raw ideas come in, and it's extremely fun, and just it's where you let your creativity flourish and stuff. Yeah, that is the fun part. So then deliver, which is also a fun part to me, but what does deliver entail? And it's user testing, which I'll explain in a second, and prototyping, like we've already covered in this class, and what you do in Figma, and in general, just coming up with your final solution and developing it. So kind of with the diamond shape again, you can see that it fans out again because you're coming up with tons of ideas on like what your solution could be. And then you're honing it in again, which one design is actually going to work the best. And you do user testing, which is basically testing your prototype or your product on the people who will be using it, being like, hey, does this actually work well? Is this actually useful to you? And then taking in that feedback into how you hone in on your design and what you're creating. So it'd be the equivalent of sending your midterm project to people who actually would use the site and being like, hey, is this a good user experience? Like, do you know how to find things? Is the placement of stuff intuitive? Is this pleasing to you? What would you expect in different places in the interface? And that's all super useful for understanding what needs to happen in your creation even more. So yeah, this is the solution designing diamond. And after you've come up with all the ideas, you hone it in again and deliver to come up with your singular solution. How can we effectively solve our problem? Is this actually useful, helpful, effective, functional, a good experience, like all the things that we've been talking about so far? And they feed in with each other the same way. And the arrows can also be kind of iteration as a, or like representing an iteration, which I'll also talk about in a second. Yeah, all the ideas you have, you may not pick just one. You can combine the ideas together to create something that addresses multiple needs. Or you came up with a solution and you did user testing and it turns out it wasn't useful, but you learned new things about what might be useful. So then you go back and you ideate again on how to solve it. And that's kind of what the process is like. It's about getting feedback continually from the people who are going to use it about like what it should be doing and what you should be creating. So yeah, and then repeat. You repeat the process over and over again in practice, probably not that many times. And the repeating kind of happens infrequently and over years, because doing a full rehaul of your site or your product is a lot. But yeah, another thing that I forgot to mention is that in the deliver section and in user testing, that's when you bring in the limitations. After you've come up with the optimal ideas, when you actually go in to create it and prototype it, that's when you're like, okay, what can I actually do given like money, time, etc.? Like, what is actually going to be the best solution we can have given what the client or the company wants and what our users want? So it's kind of a balance between those things. And yeah, so I said you just repeat over that until you have your optimal solution, hypothetically. You might remember this also from the first lecture. This kind of illustrates all the different kinds of considerations you make at each different part. So the strategy is kind of with the discover stage, you're understanding the users, you're understanding the business that you're working for. And then in define, you figure out what needs to be there, what are the requirements. And then from there, you ideate, which is kind of in between. And after that, you figure out the skeleton and the structure in your deliver stage. And surface or visual design is like the very last thing that you're doing. But you have to keep in mind all of these intricate parts of how they all feed together to create the end product. So this is kind of a lot, and also very conceptual kind of, or related to professional work. So how is this applicable to you right now in the web design decal? So I thought about this, and also when I was in this class, I wanted to incorporate the design process into my project so I could put it on my portfolio. So if you're interested in doing that, this is something to consider, at least for the final project. Yeah, so I made a short little basic level design process. It's not super, how do I say this? It's not super sophisticated, and it doesn't need to be, but it's also not super rigorous. Like, you're not going through tons of people to try to figure out who to interview, and you're not like putting in all that effort to like find things. It's like the easy, quick way for students who are just kind of in the introductory areas of design and product design. So how might we design with impact in the web design decal? So here's the process. First of all, really quick desk research. Desk research is basically Googling stuff, as I mentioned. So like a quick couple searches of what works in terms of donut sites, for example, what's needed and who uses the kind of site that you're designing for. For your final project, you're making whatever you want. So keep in mind, maybe like a lot of people make a personal website, looking for what works in terms of portfolios, what is needed. Recruiters are your users, rather than just, regular people. What are they looking for? What do they need? And yeah, that's basically some quick desk research that you could do. Then you ideate, so sketching it out, figuring out different layouts, like different ways you want to approach the problem of whatever site that you decide to create. Then you do mock-ups. And oftentimes between the sketching phase and the mock-up phase, you realize, okay, what I actually had in mind isn't actually going to work out. And that's an important step to make, and then you can go back if you need to. But that's the next step. And then after you mock it up, ask a friend for feedback. Usually I ask 1 or 2 people that I know. I'm like, hey, is this intuitive to you? Do you know how to use it? And just let them play around with it through the prototype settings, which we will probably cover on Thursday. And then you code it and you finalize it. And that's kind of the process I would suggest for this class. Heavily suggested, though. You don't need to do this if you don't have time or if you're not interested in design. But if you are, this is an easy way to introduce it into the assignment that we have and getting some first practice with it. So here's an example. I know I kind of listed out an example while I was going through that, but back to the donut site thing, you can Google what donut sites exist already, which I know some of you did, and look for inspiration there. Maybe ask your friends about what they like in a donut or a food site just casually. I'm pretty sure my friends are like kind of tired of me asking them user research questions, but it's fine. Then you want to make your low fidelity wireframes and sketches with different ideas and layouts. Then make your high fidelity prototypes. Call on those friends again or different friends for feedback on your design, and then you code and finalize and submit it to us. Yeah, that's just a cool example too. And here's kind of like my thoughts and sort of a TLDR of like how to use this in practice, other than that kind of process that I just mentioned. This is kind of more of a long-term thing and general thing about designing. When you're doing it, think about what the goal is all the time and think about who is using it and what they need, because it's not about what you think is going to be cool, which it took me a long time to learn. It's actually what they want and like what they'll actually interact with. It'll have real stakes if you're an actual designer in the industry. And there's so many examples that I won't get into of websites that have things that they definitely thought would be a cool idea, but people actually kind of hate. And I think understanding how to balance things that are super cool, maybe like things that people actually need, can be cool too. Just to make that disclaimer. But I feel like that is something that needs to be said. Like a lot of people when they start out are just like, oh, I want to like make this super fancy thing, but people don't always like or find fancy things super intuitive. And also think optimistically. Always think of like the most optimal solution first and then think about the limitations, because you want to make sure that you have in mind what actually is the best case scenario for your design. And then you work from there on, I guess, more pessimistically and more realistically about what's actually possible. And that way you're always keeping in mind like what's best for the users and best for whatever you're designing. And I guess the last and maybe the most important thing is that this process that I covered is useful, but don't blindly follow it. Make sure what you're doing is actually important for your design. Different steps along the way may not be needed. I know there's tons of methods listed on the internet for like each step there. Don't feel like you have to follow all of them in one project, or that you have to follow specific ones because they're trendy. Because I know design trends can get to people's heads. Make sure what you're doing is actually important and effective in your project, and recruiters will know whether or not it's actually important. So yeah, keep that in mind. And explore different people's processes, because I know people document them in their portfolios and in blog posts. So there are other ways to approach it than just this process or the human design process. Just be flexible, remember to empathize, and remember to iterate and continually use feedback to your advantage. So yeah, that after that long ramble, does anybody have any questions?
Is there an example of maybe something that you tried to create, but it didn't turn out that well from what you had imagined in your head? Or maybe you made something in Figma, but then realized, oh, maybe this is too hard to do and I don't want to do this anymore.
Ooh. Interesting. So most of the time I delete it if it doesn't work. I don't really keep evidence that there were things that didn't work most of the time, but hang on. I would say now that it's been a year since I did my final project for this class, I can trash it. Give me 1 second. I'm trying to find the final project showcase. Wait, Howie, do you have a link?
The showcase website?
Yeah,
Mm,
because I can't find it.
yeah, 1 sec. In the chat.
Thank you. Okay. It's super broken, which is another reason, but I did my project on rocket science very generally. And this homepage, you know, it's okay. It's fine. I forgot how I even interact with this, but I was realizing later that this design that I have is actually, I don't even remember how to, is this it? I feel like there was more. Anyways, as you can see, you can like click on different parts of it, and sure, it's cool that it's interactive, but this was pretty hard to code in practice. And also, just this isn't how people absorb things in learning. Like, I didn't do enough research into how people actually learn. So I don't think this is an effective way to learn the stuff that I was putting on here. Especially this page. Like, it's just you're reading through an aesthetic textbook, basically. And that's not the idea. These were all supposed to be animated. Very sad that I didn't get to do that. But I guess also kind of I had a different layout for all of these, basically, because I didn't draft all the text before I transferred it to code, which you should do. But like when you go from sketch to prototyping with content, the way things are going to be spaced kind of gets messed up by how much text you have. And you should be designing so that that isn't the case, or so that it minimizes the effects of it looking weird with more text or less text. I hope that makes sense. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it's because I don't know, for example, when I did my Kingpin design, I think that it was just way too ambitious. So then towards the end, once I actually started doing it, I just noticed that what I was trying to do was just way too hard for me at the time. And so then I feel like I dumbed it down, which dumbed down is not necessarily the right term. I think I just made it simpler. But even then, I think I just kind of was disillusioned and just kind of sad about my ending result compared to what I had in Figma at the beginning.
Yeah. So also this rocket was supposed to launch and fly into the next page. That's so difficult because you have to like delay the page change. And I didn't realize how complicated that would be in JavaScript, and just like when the GS or like when the TAs say something is hard, listen to them. Because Howie told me when I was in this class that that was going to be really difficult, and I was like, it's fine. It's not fine. Just try to like kind of with all these things that you think are cool, maybe look into whether or not it's something that's actually doable and into your schedule to see if you have time to learn it, because I definitely didn't do that. And that sucked. So, wait, do I actually have an end screen? I forgot. Yeah, kind of. I did this person in like 5 minutes before class started. Full disclosure. But
Yeah, if I could add something to that, I think it's great that to be ambitious, which that's totally fine. A lot of people like to be really ambitious, which is good. It's better to be that than just like very simple in the beginning. But I think a lot of it comes through experience too. So part of you learning how to mock up or design prototype website, uh, because it was like your first time doing it from scratch, like it, of course there's going to be a lot of difficulties along the way. No one said it was ever going to be easy. So um, you'll notice like the more you practice this and the more you prototype, the more you realize your limits of your knowledge. And that might even push you to drive you to go look up a lot of these functionalities that might be a little far-fetched. Like I wouldn't say just give up because you just don't have the knowledge. At least do some Google searching. If it's like Asia, she actually like tried searching for those animations and page delays. Like it's not like once she got to coding, she just gave up just because it was too hard.
I coded up until like the second I had to present. Like that's how much I put into that.
Yeah. So I think all of it's through experience, and like you've probably learned a lot through the midterm project that you'll implement into your final project, and same thing from final project to like anything else you do beyond this class. So don't worry about like dumbing things down. It's not as bad as you think because a lot of designers actually do that, and they're really limited by the reality. Like they get budget cuts or like they have shorter amount of time to deliver something. It's worse in that sense. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good response. But also don't feel like you need to work up until the last second like I did. Yeah, I guess a couple last things for the people who are still here. Like Howie already mentioned in chat, we highly recommend you guys come out to office hours or lab to ask questions if you're like the slightest bit confused with JavaScript in this intro, because if you don't understand this, it'll just kind of get harder from here. And the material that we'll be covering from now on will be heavily dependent on that, on your understanding of this first lecture. And we understand that a lot of people don't really have experience with coding that are in this class, or very little experience with coding. So if that's you, come to office hours. And also it's Bianca's birthday, so wish her happy birthday.
I think she left.
Yeah, I think she did.
Yeah.
But I forgot to mention that at the beginning.
It's all good.
Yeah. Bye guys. Good luck with